Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
Picture this moment unfolding in the midst of a relentless downpour on a nondescript Tuesday evening in suburban Ohio, where I found myself frozen in front of my office computer screen as the impersonal email from corporate headquarters delivered the crushing news of widespread layoffs, attributing the decision to some vague economic turbulence that conveniently spared the executives their lavish compensations while upending the lives of dedicated employees like me who had invested 12 long years into refining complex software systems, mentoring eager newcomers, and essentially keeping the entire operation running smoothly behind the scenes. As the fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an irritating persistence that seemed to mock my sudden obsolescence, a profound emptiness settled into my chest. That insidious inner voice resurfacing to remind me of all the times I'd questioned whether my relentless pursuit of innovation in the tech world truly mattered or if it had all been leading to this abrupt dismissal that left me questioning every late-night coding session and every compromise I'd made along the way. With the rain pounding against the windshield like an unrelenting accusation during my drive home through the blurred streets lined with familiar strip malls and modest ranch-style houses, I mentally rehearsed the conversation I anticipated having with my husband Mike, whom I'd shared the past 8 years with through moves for better opportunities and shared dreams that had somehow frayed into routine silences, and my father Robert, the retired factory foreman who still resided in the same split-level home from my childhood, embodying that old-school American ethos of unwavering stability where success was measured solely by a reliable paycheck and the absence of any visible setbacks. The type of man who meticulously clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and delivered impassioned monologues about pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, as if it were the only path to legitimacy in a world he viewed through the lens of his own unyielding experiences. I imagined them offering solace, perhaps even joining me over a couple of cold beers to brainstorm my next steps forward, because in my optimistic haze designed to stave off the rising panic, I clung to the belief that family bonds, forged in the everyday struggles of Midwestern life, would provide the anchor I desperately needed during this unexpected freefall. Pulling into the driveway with water already seeping through my coat as I dashed toward the porch light that flickered like a hesitant beacon, I pushed open the front door and let the words spill out in a rush, detailing the injustice of the layoff, the bewildering speed at which my contributions had been erased, and the swirling uncertainties about how I would navigate the financial tightrope ahead, expecting in return the comforting embrace, or at least a few reassuring words that might dull the sharp edges of my vulnerability. Instead, my father, seated with his feet propped on the worn coffee table and a glass of Scotch balanced precariously in his hand, reacted with a sudden explosion of frustration, his face contorting into a mask of disapproval as he declared that I'd always harbored a softness ill-suited to the harsh realities of the workforce, that my fascination with these elusive tech pursuits had diverted me from pursuing something truly secure. And now, at the age of 42, I stood exposed as an undeniable failure whose presence would only serve to burden the household he had maintained through decades of grueling labor, culminating in his barked command to pack my belongings immediately because individuals who faltered in such spectacular fashion had no place lingering under his roof, no right to impose their disappointments on those who had managed to persevere without faltering. Throughout this tirade, my husband Mike lingered near the kitchen island with his arms folded defensively across his chest, his gaze averted as if the peeling paint on the far wall held more interest than my unraveling world. Initially offering nothing more than a subdued nod of agreement that felt like a knife twisting slowly in an already wounded heart, before he finally mustered the courage to reveal his own devastating departure, admitting in a low, evasive murmur that dissatisfaction had been simmering within him for months, that his connection with Lisa from the accounting department had reignited a sense of vitality he claimed to have lost in our marriage, and that he was walking out right then with a suitcase already positioned by the door as evidence of premeditation that shattered any illusion of spontaneity in his betrayal. I stood there, drenched from the storm outside and now emotionally saturated from the storm within, observing through the window as his car's taillights dissolved into the sheets of rain cascading down the street, my heart fracturing into fragments that seemed to multiply with each passing second, while my father turned his back dismissively, muttering under his breath about the necessity of tough love as the sole mechanism for instilling resilience in those who strayed too far from the path of conventional achievement. In that moment of profound isolation, surrounded by the echoes of their condemnations that reverberated off the familiar walls adorned with family photos capturing happier, more unified times, I chose to withhold the truths that could have altered the narrative entirely, remaining utterly silent about the tech startup I had been meticulously cultivating in the shadows for the past 2 years. An innovative application designed to facilitate remote mental health coaching sessions tailored specifically for the overworked professionals and stressed families prevalent in communities just like ours, developed during those clandestine late-night hours when the house was quiet and my focus sharpened into something resembling quiet defiance, already garnering a modest but growing cadre of beta users who appreciated its intuitive interface and personalized guidance without any awareness from those closest to me. Similarly, I refrained from mentioning the lake house secured in a trust from my late mother's estate, a serene retreat nestled along the shores of Lake Erie encompassing 30 acres of tranquil woodland and a sturdy dock that extended invitingly over the water. An asset of considerable value that represented not just financial security, but a personal sanctuary I had preserved through discreet payments from freelance gigs, viewing it as my unspoken insurance policy against the very vulnerabilities now manifesting so cruelly in my life. With a surge of determination masking the tears that threatened to betray my composure, I hastily gathered a few essential belongings into the back of my car, the engine roaring to life amid the persistent downpour as I navigated away from the only home I had known for decades, steering toward the uncertain horizon where the highway lights blurred into streaks of possibility and regret intertwined. As the miles accumulated and the suburbs gave way to darker rural stretches flanked by silhouettes of farmhouses and distant silos, a persistent question gnawed at the edges of my resolve, pondering whether my decision to maintain that veil of silence constituted the gravest error of judgment, potentially dooming me to unnecessary suffering, or if it served as the initial forging of an unyielding armor that would ultimately shield me from further assaults on my dignity and autonomy. Just as the weight of solitude began to press more heavily upon me, my phone vibrated insistently within my pocket, displaying an unfamiliar number that compelled me to pull over beneath the shelter of an overpass, and upon answering, a professional voice on the other end introduced an intriguing proposition concerning my covert project, hinting at opportunities that could redefine my trajectory if I summoned the courage to embrace the inherent risks involved in stepping fully into the light. Emerging from the haze of that tumultuous drive under the cover of night, I arrived at the lake house just as the first hints of dawn began to soften the edges of the surrounding pines, the property materializing like a half-remembered dream from my childhood summers spent with Mom, where the air carried the crisp scent of damp earth and evergreens mingling with the faint, briny whisper of Lake Erie lapping persistently against the weathered dock that extended from the modest cedar cabin's rear. A 2-story haven encompassing 30 acres of secluded woodland that she had inherited from her own parents and quietly transferred into a trust for me upon her untimely passing 5 years earlier due to complications from a heart condition that struck without warning during what should have been a routine checkup. As I fumbled with the key in the lock, the door creaking open to reveal interiors untouched since my last escape weekend months prior, dusted with a fine layer of neglect that spoke volumes about the life I had paused to maintain appearances in the city. A wave of tentative relief washed over me, tempered immediately by the encroaching solitude that amplified every small sound from the settling structure and the distant call of loons echoing across the water, reminding me that this sanctuary, while financially substantial enough to rival urban real estate values back home, now served as both refuge and reminder of the familial fractures I had left behind without a single backward glance. Unloading my hastily packed belongings into the spare room that I quickly repurposed as an improvised office space, complete with the extension cords and power strips I had stashed during previous visits for just such contingencies, I powered up my dual monitors and dove headlong into the digital world of Havenlink, the tech startup I had nurtured in secrecy for the past 2 years as a platform offering remote mental health coaching through secure video sessions enhanced by subtle AI-driven prompts designed to encourage users, particularly those in the overburdened middle-class demographics of the Midwest, like overworked parents juggling school runs and mortgages, or professionals teetering on the edge of burnout from endless virtual meetings, to articulate their suppressed anxieties in a structured yet empathetic environment that drew inspiration from the casual support circles Mom had facilitated in our neighborhood during tougher times. With no corporate deadlines looming for the first time in over a decade, I immersed myself in refinements, adjusting algorithms to better personalize session recommendations based on user feedback from the modest beta group that had organically grown through discrete postings in online forums dedicated to work-life balance and emotional resilience. The steady trickle of new signups providing a quiet thrill that contrasted sharply with the emotional void left by Dad's explosive rejection and Mike's calculated exit, even as self-doubt crept in during quieter moments when the lake's stillness mirrored the isolation gnawing at my resolve and prompting questions about whether persisting in this clandestine endeavor represented genuine progress or merely a prolonged denial of the need for human connection beyond code and interfaces. That initial sense of productive isolation began to fracture during my first venture into the nearby town of Bayview for supplies, a quaint community of about 5,000 souls clustered around a single main street lined with mom-and-pop stores and a diner that served bottomless coffee strong enough to wake the dead, where the cashier named Edna, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s sporting cat-eye glasses and a name tag pinned crookedly to her floral blouse, scrutinized my out-of-state license plates with the unabashed curiosity typical of small-town life and launched into a barrage of assumptions about my circumstances, pegging me immediately as the latest addition to the roster of city escapees, fleeing messy divorces or career implosions to lick wounds in temporary rentals by the water. I managed a chuckle that bubbled up unexpectedly amid the absurdity of her well-meaning but intrusive probing, responding with a vague quip about seeking a fresh perspective while piling my cart high with instant noodles, a case of inexpensive wine, and fresh produce that promised at least the illusion of self-sufficiency, the humor in the exchange serving as a brief antidote to the heavier burdens weighing on me and underscoring how life, even at its most disheveled, retained pockets of levity that prevented total despair from taking hold, much like the way a sudden ray of sunlight-piercing storm clouds could transform a gloomy afternoon into something almost bearable. Yet the levity dissipated swiftly upon returning to the cabin and checking my messages, where a voicemail from a mutual acquaintance back in Columbus delivered the stinging revelation that Mike's entanglement with Lisa from the accounting department had extended far beyond the sporadic encounters I had suspected during his increasingly frequent late nights at the office, stretching instead to nearly a full year of clandestine meetings and shared hotel stays disguised as out-of-town conferences, a duration that transformed his betrayal from an impulsive lapse into a deliberate, sustained deception that had unraveled the fabric of our shared history thread by thread while I remained oblivious, pouring my energies into projects that now felt tainted by his unspoken sabotage. The knowledge ignited a slow-burning fury that I directed productively rather than destructively, composing an email to Dad that struck a balance between casual nonchalance and subtle provocation, informing him that I had secured a temporary arrangement house-sitting a property up north, which alleviated any concern about my immediate stability, and attaching a photograph of the lake captured at sunset with its surface shimmering like molten gold under the fading light. An image that conveyed understated prosperity without explicit details and elicited a terse reply from him laced with probing questions about the nature of this supposed gig, allowing me the small satisfaction of a witty retaliation that forced him to grapple with the possibility that his hasty judgment might have overlooked depths he never bothered to plumb, a clever nudge toward regret without granting him the full revelation he perhaps subconsciously craved. As the days melded into a rhythm punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of keys during marathon coding sessions interspersed with invigorating walks along the shoreline, where smooth pebbles shifted underfoot and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. A deer pausing at the tree lean or a flock of geese slicing through the sky provided fleeting companionship. HavenLink's metrics continued their upward trajectory, with user engagement metrics reflecting genuine impact in the testimonials pouring in about reclaimed clarity amid daily chaos. Yet the persistent undercurrent of uncertainty lingered in the form of unanswered voicemails from Dad that I deleted unlistened and the emotional echo of Mike's abandonment that surfaced during solitary evenings by the fireplace, where the crackle of burning logs failed to fully drown out the what-ifs about whether bridging the silence with truths about my burgeoning enterprise might have spared me this profound aloneness, or if enduring it honed a resilience essential for the battles ahead. Then, on a crisp afternoon when the autumn foliage painted the landscape in vibrant hues of crimson and amber, framing the cabin like a living postcard, my inbox chimed with an unsolicited message from Elena Vargas, a venture capitalist whose firm specialized in health technology investments and who had apparently stumbled upon my preliminary outreach from months earlier through a shared professional network, expressing keen interest in discussing a potential partnership that could propel HavenLink toward a comprehensive launch with substantial funding, though the fine print in her proposal hinted at complications arising from her organization's historical connections to my former employer, presenting a tantalizing opportunity laced with the very entanglements I had sought to escape. Stepping into the bustling atmosphere of that upscale Cleveland cafe perched high above the winding Cuyahoga River on a brilliantly clear autumn day, where the sunlight danced across the glass walls and cast shimmering reflections on the polished wooden tables laden with artisanal pastries and steaming lattes that carried prices steep enough to make a frugal Midwesterner wince, I felt the weight of anticipation settle over me like a tailored suit too tight in the shoulders as I prepared to pitch HavenLink to Elena Vargas, the venture capitalist whose email had arrived like a lifeline wrapped in barbed wire. Her firm renowned for injecting capital into promising health tech ventures that address the unspoken mental strains plaguing everyday Americans, from factory workers enduring shift changes to office dwellers buried under endless email threads. Yet her proposal came burdened with the revelation that her partners maintained long-standing ties to the very corporate entity responsible for my abrupt layoff, a connection that promised both accelerated growth for my app's innovative blend of AI-guided therapy prompts and live sessions tailored to foster vulnerability in users hesitant to seek traditional help amid the stigma still lingering in heartland communities. As Elena arrived precisely on time, her posture exuding the confidence of someone who had navigated boardrooms filled with skeptical investors for over 2 decades, with her sleek bob haircut framing a face etched with the subtle lines of hard-won experience and a firm handshake that conveyed unyielding determination. We delved into the details over cups of espresso that buzzed with intensity mirroring my own nervous energy, where I elaborated on HavenLink's core mission to provide accessible mental health support through intuitive interfaces that drew from real-life anecdotes like the neighborhood support groups Mom had organized back home, emphasizing how the platform's user retention rates had climbed steadily thanks to testimonials from subscribers who credited its gentle nudges with helping them navigate divorces, job losses, and the quiet desperations of suburban existence without the intimidation of clinical settings. Throughout the conversation, which stretched from the cafe's initial rush into a quieter afternoon lull where the river traffic below provided a soothing backdrop of barges gliding lazily along the waterway, Elena probed deeply into the app's scalability potential, her eyes narrowing appreciatively at the metrics I presented on my tablet, showing a surge in beta users engaging with features like anonymous chat forums inspired by the casual confessions shared around backyard barbecues in Ohio summers, but she circled back repeatedly to the equity demands of her firm, outlining a deal structure that would infuse $50,000 upfront for a significant ownership stake and a board position, all while alluding to the benefits of leveraging their network for talent acquisition. A network that unfortunately overlapped with my former colleagues who might view my independent venture as a direct threat or even a poachable idea given the industry's cutthroat undercurrents where loyalty often dissolved faster than morning mist over the lake. Leaving the meeting with a tentative agreement to review the contracts and a business card pressed into my hand that felt heavier than its cardstock weight suggested, I wandered the bustling downtown streets lined with historic brick buildings and trendy boutiques catering to the city's revitalized professional class, my mind swirling with the dilemmas this opportunity presented. Torn between the allure of rapid expansion that could solidify Havenlink as a legitimate force in the mental health space and the peril of re-entering an ecosystem rife with the same betrayals that had propelled me into isolation. A conflict that undoubtedly would frustrate listeners who might argue for immediate transparency with family to garner emotional support rather than persisting in this solitary gamble that amplified every risk while withholding the potential rewards from those who had dismissed me so callously. Back at the lake house, where the autumn chill had begun to seep through the cabin seams, prompting me to light the fireplace with logs stacked neatly by the hearth and wrap myself in a wool blanket reminiscent of the ones Mom used to knit during winter evenings. I channeled the post-meeting adrenaline into further enhancements on the platform, incorporating group support modules based on the communal storytelling traditions of Midwestern potlucks, where neighbors aired grievances over slices of apple pie and cups of strong coffee. A move that quickly attracted a respected local therapist from Bayview as an advisor, whose endorsement lent an air of professional validation to the burgeoning enterprise and spurred a fresh wave of signups from online communities focused on work-life integration for the 30 to 50 demographic grappling with the dual pressures of career ambitions and family obligations. Amid this progress, a spark of unexpected levity emerged during an impromptu blind date arranged by Edna the cashier, who had cornered me at the grocery store with her insistent matchmaking tendencies and set me up with Tom, a local handyman in his late 40s whose flannel shirt strained against his broad frame as he launched into a monologue about his ex-wife's relentless alimony demands over greasy diner burgers that tasted like reheated regret, his attempts at charm devolving into complaints that made the evening feel less like romance and more like an audition for a support group session, prompting me to excuse myself early with a polite fabrication about a pressing deadline and drive home laughing through the tears of absurdity at how the dating scene post-betrayal resembled nothing so much as sifting through a junk drawer for something salvageable. A humorous reminder that even in the depths of personal reinvention, human folly provided comic relief to temper the heavier emotional loads. However, the lighter moments proved fleeting when an email from Jake, an erstwhile colleague from the tech firm who had always positioned himself as a friendly rival during team brainstorming sessions, arrived offering his expertise in scaling user interfaces for Havenlink. A gesture that initially seemed fortuitous until I cross-referenced his credentials and uncovered through discreet industry forums that he had been instrumental in feeding HR the narrative of my divided attentions during the lead-up to the layoffs, a calculated maneuver to elevate his own standing by undermining mine in the eyes of management who prized undivided loyalty above innovative side pursuits. The discovery of this betrayal, layered atop the fresh wounds from Mike and Dad, fueled a resolve to respond not with confrontation but with calculated subtlety. As I anonymously submitted a tip to a prominent tech newsletter highlighting discrepancies in Jake's portfolio of freelance gigs that bordered on ethical gray areas, observing from the sidelines as his professional online presence erupted with inquiries and defensive posts that chipped away at his carefully curated image. A form of revenge that carried the wit of a well-placed chess move rather than the blunt force of direct accusation, and provided a satisfying undercurrent of justice without drawing unwanted attention to my own operations. Compounding the interpersonal tensions, a handwritten postcard from Dad materialized in my mailbox, its edges frayed from travel and his familiar scrawl demanding clarification on whether I was truly squandering my potential in some remote hideaway or if this phase represented yet another detour from the stable path he envisioned. Infused with that classic guilt-laden undertone designed to evoke compliance through emotional leverage, nearly compelling me to dial his number and unveil fragments of my achievements to shatter his presumptions, but ultimately restrained by the same pride that had silenced me that fateful night, opting instead for a non-committal reply alluding to promising explorations without specifics that left him adrift in speculation. As the days shortened and the lake's surface turned to a mirror reflecting the fiery canopy of fall foliage that surrounded the cabin in a protective embrace, Havenlink crossed the threshold of 500 active users, with Elena's follow-up correspondence arriving thick with legal jargon outlining protective clauses for intellectual property that I negotiated fiercely over late-night video calls. Her dry humor about my tenacious lakefront bargaining style forging an unlikely rapport amid the high-stakes maneuvering, yet the pervasive uncertainty persisted in the form of Dad's unanswered overtures and the lingering specter of Mike's abandonment that surfaced during solitary reflections by the water's edge. Then, as twilight descended one evening, painting the sky in deepening shades of indigo and the chill air carried the first hints of impending winter, the sharp ring of the doorbell pierced the quiet, insistent and unyielding, and peering through the peephole revealed the unmistakable outline of Dad's battered pickup truck parked in the gravel drive, with him standing on the porch, arms crossed in that stubborn posture demanding entry into the world I had so carefully walled off from his judgments. The insistent clamor of the doorbell reverberating through the cabin's wooden frame on that encroaching evening, with the sun dipping low enough to cast elongated shadows across the gravel driveway where Dad's weathered pickup truck sat like an unwelcome sentinel amid the rustling autumn leaves, forced me to confront the intrusion head-on after days of fortifying my solitude against such familial encroachments, his silhouette visible through the peephole in that familiar stance of arms folded tightly across his chest and jaw set in the unyielding determination that had defined his approach to every challenge, from factory line disputes to raising a single daughter after Mom's passing. A posture that now symbolized not just paternal concern, but the very judgments that had driven me northward in search of uncompromised space to nurture Havenlink without the overlay of his expectations for a life measured in predictable milestones, rather than innovative risks. Swinging the door open wider than caution might dictate, allowing the cool lakeside breeze to carry in the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke, I faced him directly under the porch light that flickered to life automatically, his eyes scanning past me into the warmly lit interior where my monitors glowed with lines of code and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered, prompting an immediate barrage of questions about this unexpected lakeside existence that he presumed must involve some form of idleness or desperation, given his last memory of me as the freshly unemployed failure he had summarily evicted from his home. His voice gruff yet laced with an undercurrent of worry that softened the edges of his habitual bluntness as he stepped inside without awaiting an explicit invitation, shedding his jacket onto the nearest chair and settling at the kitchen table as if reclaiming territory long ceded. Over mugs of the strong black coffee I poured to buy precious moments for composing my thoughts amid the crackle of the fireplace that painted dancing shadows on the walls adorned with faded family photos from better days. Dad launched into a monologue that blended reluctant admissions with his trademark lectures, confessing that the loneliness had deepened in the months since our blow-up, that evicting me had stemmed more from his own fears of watching me repeat what he perceived as my youthful drifts away from stability than from outright disdain, while simultaneously recounting how Mike had reached out in the aftermath of his departure, painting a picture of marital discord where my absorption in work had allegedly eroded their connection and positioning Lisa as the revitalizing force who brought energy back into his routine. A narrative that twisted like a knife in my gut for its selective omissions and the ease with which Dad absorbed it as validation of his tough love philosophy, without once questioning the integrity of the man who had abandoned ship at the first sign of turbulence. In the midst of this exchange, where the lake outside murmured softly against the dock, as if echoing the unresolved tensions hanging between us, I navigated a delicate path of partial disclosures, alluding to the late-night projects that now occupied my time and yielded tangible progress without naming Havenlink outright or revealing the trust fund that underpinned this very property. Choices that undoubtedly would elicit frustration from those hearing my story for clinging to secrecy in a moment ripe for reconciliation, preferring the armor of withheld truths over the vulnerability of full candor that might invite further scrutiny or, worse, opportunistic involvement in my hard-won independence. Even as a flicker of temptation arose to shatter his assumptions with the app's growing user base and the impending deal with Elena, a temptation quelled by the memory of his barked dismissals that night of the layoff. As the conversation meandered through the minefield of family history, with Dad probing deeper into the specifics of my daily routine and expressing a grudging curiosity about the tech world that had always seemed to him like an abstract realm of fleeting fortunes rather than the solid trades he revered. The undercurrents of business pressures intruded via a discreet notification on my phone that I silenced hastily, drawing from an industry contact alerting me to Lisa's recent maneuverings, where the woman who had so seamlessly inserted herself into Mike's life had now transitioned to a rival health tech startup and was aggressively pitching a derivative application suspiciously similar to Havenlink's core features, cribbing elements from public demos and internal leaks that traced back to whispers in my former company's corridors. A sabotage veiled in professional ambition that threatened to dilute my platform's uniqueness just as momentum built toward the funding infusion from Elena's firm. This revelation amplified the dilemmas swirling in my mind, particularly as I weighed the merits of finalizing the partnership despite its entangled connections. A risky proposition that could accelerate Havenlink's reach to thousands seeking mental health tools amid the economic anxieties gripping the nation from Rust Belt towns to bustling metros. Yet one that exposed me to potential backlash from old associates eager to undermine the underdog narrative I was quietly crafting, decisions that positioned me on a precipice where transparency with Dad might have garnered unexpected alliance, but instead perpetuated the isolation I had chosen as my forge for resilience. Injecting a dose of wry humor into the thickening air to diffuse the intensity, I quipped about how the lake's serene isolation served as the ultimate debugger for life's glitches, far superior to the chaotic boardrooms Dad romanticized in his tales of union battles, eliciting a reluctant chuckle from him that cracked the facade of his stern demeanor and briefly transformed the evening into something resembling the easy evenings of my youth spent listening to stories by the fire, though the levity masked a deeper undercurrent of light vulgarity in my internal assessment of the situation as a real kick in the pants that family ties could twist into knots without warning, prompting me to steer the dialogue toward lighter territories like the changing foliage outside before gently ushering him toward departure with promises of future updates. The true escalation of revenge materialized in the days following his visit, as I orchestrated a subtle public exposure by submitting an anonymized case study of Havenlink's innovative approach to a prominent women's entrepreneurship podcast, framing it as a tale of quiet perseverance in the face of personal and professional upheavals without naming names, which rapidly gained traction in online circles and overshadowed Lisa's pitches with glowing endorsements from early adopters, a clever maneuver that not only bolstered my app's visibility, but sowed seeds of doubt in her venture's originality. Watching from afar as industry chatter turned her spotlight dimmer, while mine intensified without direct confrontation. Yet as Dad drove off into the twilight, his truck's taillights fading along the winding lakeside road with a parting wave that carried unspoken hopes for mending, the fragile bridge we had tentatively rebuilt trembled under the weight of unresolved secrets. And just as I exhaled in the returning quiet, my phone illuminated with a text from Mike's number, its words pleading urgently for a face-to-face conversation where he claimed to possess a monumental confession capable of reshaping the ruins of our shared past in ways I could scarcely anticipate. The persistent glow of Mike's text message on my phone screen that evening after Dad's departure lingered like an unresolved chord in the symphony of my appended life, its words promising a confession of such magnitude that it could potentially rewrite the fractured narrative of our 8-year marriage, which had unraveled not in a single dramatic unraveling, but through a series of subtle erosions from his growing detachment during shared meals where conversations dwindled to logistics and my increasing immersion in Haven Link's development that he had once dismissed as a harmless distraction, now compelling me to arrange a meeting at a nondescript roadside diner halfway between the lake house and his new apartment in Columbus. A venue chosen for its neutrality with vinyl booths scarred by countless similar encounters of regret and bottomless pots of coffee that steamed with the bitter undertones of nostalgia for simpler times when our partnership felt unbreakable amid the everyday grind of Midwestern domesticity. Driving there the next morning under a sky heavy with overcast clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in my chest. The highway flanked by harvested fields stretching barren toward the horizon and dotted with billboards advertising quick-fix solutions to life's persistent ailments from debt consolidation to miracle diets. I mentally fortified myself against whatever revelations he might unleash, determined to maintain the boundaries I had erected through months of self-imposed exile while grappling with the internal conflict of whether my prolonged silence about the startup and the Lake House Trust had deepened the chasm between us irreparably or preserved a dignity that full disclosure might have compromised in the heat of his betrayal. A choice that listeners to this tale might view with exasperation for prioritizing pride over potential reconciliation at a juncture when vulnerability could have invited healing rather than further isolation. Sliding into the booth across from him in the diner's dimly lit interior where the sizzle of griddles and clatter of plates formed a cacophony underscoring the awkwardness of our reunion, Mike appeared diminished from the confident salesman I had married. His tie loosened haphazardly and dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights that contrasted with the poised facade he attempted to project as he launched into a torrent of apologies laced with self-justification, recounting how Lisa's allure had initially promised an escape from the monotony he attributed to our routine, but ultimately exposed her as a manipulative opportunist who had exploited his vulnerabilities to advance her career. A dynamic that culminated in her abrupt departure once his usefulness waned, leaving him adrift in a rented efficiency that echoed with the emptiness of his choices. As the conversation deepened over refills of coffee that grew progressively cooler paralleling the chill settling between us, the pivotal twist emerged in his halting admissions, where he confessed to having discovered traces of Haven Link on my laptop during one of his sporadic cleaning sprees months before the layoff. A discovery that ignited jealousy over my secretive success, which he perceived as a diversion from their shared life, prompting him in a misguided bid to force my dependence upon him to anonymously relay details of the project to Lisa through a mutual contact, enabling her to pitch a derivative version at her new firm in an attempt to sabotage my momentum and compel me to return humbled to the marriage he envisioned as his sole domain. A deception that layered betrayal upon betrayal and transformed his infidelity from personal failing to calculated interference in the very enterprise that had become my lifeline. The weight of this revelation pressed upon me like the humid air before a thunderstorm, stirring a complex brew of fury and sorrow that I masked with a wry observation about how his version of support had inadvertently gifted me the clarity to thrive without the anchors of doubt he represented. Watching as his expression crumpled under the implication that his actions had not diminished me but liberated me to secure Elena's investment, which had propelled Haven Link to a valuation soaring into seven figures with users spanning the heartland from Ohio steel towns to Michigan auto plants. Their stories of reclaimed emotional ground through the app's empathetic interfaces serving as testament to the impact born from the very rejection he had orchestrated. In the ensuing days, the orchestration of revenge unfolded with meticulous precision, beginning with an invitation extended to Dad for the official launch demo in Columbus, where the event space buzzed with venture capitalists and media representatives drawn to tales of resilient innovation, positioning him inconspicuously in the audience so that as I ascended the stage to articulate how familial dismissal and spousal abandonment had fueled the platform's creation as a beacon for those navigating similar heartaches, his face registered a dawning recognition that evolved into stunned applause amid murmurs of paternal oversight, a public vindication that forced him to confront the oversight of his tough love edict without me uttering a single accusatory word. The satisfaction derived from his reluctant pride mingling with the subtle sting of what might have been had he believed sooner. Extending the thread of witty retribution toward Lisa, I maneuvered through a blind recruitment channel to extend her an entry-level position at Havenlink, framed as a fresh start in a burgeoning field. The anonymity ensuring she accepted without grasping the ironic reversal where her attempted poaching now positioned her as a subordinate contributor to the very success she sought to undermine. A move that circulated through industry whispers and amplified the narrative of underdog triumph while diminishing her stature in the eyes of peers who had once viewed her as a rising star. Mike's final plea for reconciliation arrived via a desperate voicemail echoing the vulnerability he had once withheld, begging to rebuild on terms that acknowledged my achievements, but I responded with measured distance. The lake house, now a bustling remote hub for the team with its dock hosting informal strategy sessions under starlit skies, allowing me to ponder the ripples of their regrets as Dad initiated tentative overtures for family gatherings laced with unspoken apologies, and Mike faded into occasional check-ins that carried the weight of irretrievable loss. Standing alone on that same dock one twilight, as the water lapped rhythmically below carrying whispers of unresolved possibilities, I questioned whether the vengeance exacted through silence and success had mended the fractures of betrayal or merely etched new ones into my spirit, leaving the enduring query of if their remorse stretched into forever or dissolved into the vast uncertainties of time, a contemplation that invited reflection on the true cost of solitude's sovereignty without yielding a definitive resolution.